Hello all, another reminder that you still need to be doing your assigned reading for school and doing all of your homework for class, and watch these videos as a supplement to your U.S. history, world history, government, and race and immigration classes if you have them. Today we'll be quickly discussing why and how schools in the United States are still segregated. To understand school segregation, both in the past and at present, you have to first understand how the public school system works in the United States. All students from elementary school through the age of 16 in most states are required to go to school. That's called compulsory education. Because the government requires that young people go to school, they have to provide an option, which is public schools that are accessible to all students. As many of you know, because you attend public schools, where students go to school is often based on their geographical location, meaning that you go to school near where you live for the most part. And that's really key to understanding how and why schools are still often very, very segregated. First, let's take a look at some of the history and a timeline of the school desegregation process that began in 1954. I apologize for my terrible handwriting. First up, we have the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case in 1954 that ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional and all students had the right to an equal educational opportunity in the United States. If you're interested in more information about the Brown versus Board of Education case, please see our other videos about civil rights. Brown versus Board of Education ruled that segregating schools was unconstitutional and that all students had an equal right to education, but didn't necessarily give clear guidelines about how school integration would take place. Students like Ruby Bridges and the Little Rock Nine were integral and were key people in integrating schools during this period. Throughout all of this, through the 1950s and the 1960s, you have the continuation of the civil rights movement, and then we move on to the 1960s and the 1970s, where you get suburbanization and the advent of something called white flight, and we're going to describe what white flight is. Here we have the concept of white flight. After slavery and Reconstruction, as Black people in the United States were given more rights and more access to things like jobs, they moved to big cities like New York, Detroit, Chicago, because that's where jobs were available and that's also where housing was available. At the same time, cars became more and more available, and folks with money bought more cars. Those people were often white people who had Black people moving into their cities where they had previously lived and worked. Because they had cars, they were able to move out of the city into newly created suburbs, which were areas right outside of the city, where they could live in single-family homes instead of in more cramped conditions, and drive into work because they had cars. This continued into what we call residential segregation, where people of different races end up not living near each other because of socioeconomic differences. In 1971, formal busing programs where students were placed on school buses to go from one community to another to go to school were introduced. This had always been happening, kids always rode the school bus, but now the program was structured so that integration would happen. As you can see, busing programs lasted formally for 28 years. In 1999, the courts ended court-ordered busing, which means it was no longer a mandate, although many of you even go to schools where you're bused from one community to another to go to a school. Something that I didn't add on the timeline because it doesn't necessarily fit in one distinct period is immigration. Immigration is really important to understanding the context of school segregation and why it still happens, because it diversifies the local communities that feed into public schools. I'm currently standing on land that used to be Mexico, and that's just really important context in understanding why and how schools are still segregated and why we have such complicated racial and ethnic relations in this country. Here's the data from 2019. All of this is according to a UCLA study. Currently, white students attend schools that are, on average, 69% white. Latinx students attend schools that are, on average, 55% Latinx, and Black students attend schools that are, on average, 47% Black. You'll see that I've written some numbers on the side in blue. Those numbers are the proportion of enrollment by racial group in schools today. You'd think if things were relatively integrated, that the numbers in blue would match the numbers in orange. that if, for example, in schools in total in the United States, there are roughly 26% Latinx students, that those students would be more evenly distributed across schools if we were more integrated, rather than most Latinx students attending schools that are roughly 55% Latinx. Now, you might watch this and say, well, what's wrong with that? I like going to school with people of my race. I enjoy being around my community, and that's really awesome, and it's really, really great to be able to share in community with people who you're familiar with. However, Brown versus Board of Education also told us that separate is not equal. It's important to note in this conversation that in the United States, Black people are 2 times more likely to live in poverty than white people, and Latinx people are 1.8 times more likely than white people to live in poverty. And because much of public school funding comes from the local tax dollars of the local community, it matters where you go to school, because it matters if your local community gives more or less tax dollars to the education system. That directly impacts the quality of education you're going to get, because it directly impacts how much money goes into the school. That means how much teachers are paid, how much access to technology you have, what the quality of the materials, the books, and all the supplies are. So then what happened? Effectively, what happened is that as white folks moved out of major cities, what's known as white flight, and into suburban areas, they were able to create their own schools as more and more Black folks and eventually Latino folks moved into those city schools. Not being integrated and not having the resource that integration allows you, and I mean financial resource, and also resource of having an institution that's been there for a long time, that's super, super valuable. Having something that's very practiced, having teachers who have been at a school and in a district for a really long time is a valuable resource. Not having all of those things really diminishes the quality of the school systems that folks in cities had access to. Additionally, when people immigrate, they're incredibly likely to immigrate to a place where there's already an established community of people from their home country. Often people create what are known as ethnic enclaves, which are little pockets of folks who have a shared cultural experience, perhaps from another country, within the place that they immigrate to. That totally makes sense that people would do that. That's how people put down roots, create family, and create a community in their new place. However, it also means that things continue to be less and less integrated as folks move into areas with their family or with people that they may have ties to. It also, because of the dramatic structural inequalities in the United States, often people don't have the opportunity to move to wherever they'd like to move to, but rather need to move where they can afford to move to, and that's often with people they already know. All of these systems interacting with one another, the white flight to the suburbs of the 1960s through the 1970s, the systems that keep people in poverty in this country and disproportionately impact people of color in keeping them in poverty in this country, as well as immigration patterns, all have come together to create a system of residential segregation, which means that people are forced to live in different areas and different communities based often on their race. And that is often because of how much money folks have, and those that falls many times in this country along racial lines. And consequentially, because in this country, we assign kids to public schools based on their communities and based on where they live, residential segregation creates school segregation. And that's it. That is most broadly how it works. Obviously, there are a lot of specifics that we didn't cover today. If you have questions, please let me know in the comments, and I'm more than happy to do a deeper dive into any specific topic. Thank you for watching, and let us know if there's anything else that we can help you with. Bye, everyone.